The morning sun was just peeking over the desert hills when Jake stepped out of his farmhouse, coffee mug in hand. He'd been living on this small ranch in Nevada for almost 20 years now, and every single morning started the same way. First, he'd check on his animals, then tend to the water troughs, and finally get started on whatever repairs or chores needed doing that day. Jake wasn't a big-time rancher like some of his neighbors. He had just enough land to keep a few horses, some chickens, a couple of goats, and his favorite animal of all, an old donkey named Buster. People always asked him why he kept a donkey, and Jake would just smile and say that Buster was the smartest animal he'd ever owned. That donkey had more sense than most people, Jake knew. As he walked toward the barn area, Jake could already hear the animals stirring. The chickens were clucking softly, and he could see his horses moving around in the pasture. But it was Buster who always caught his attention first. That donkey had the most predictable routine of any animal on the property. Every morning, without fail, Buster would be the first one at the big water trough near the barn. The donkey would walk up slowly, sniff around for a moment, then drink long and deep. He'd take his time, sometimes spending 5 or 10 minutes just standing there, taking sip after sip. After he was done, he'd wander off to find the best spots to graze, always seeming to know exactly where the sweetest grass was growing. Jake had learned to rely on this routine. If Buster was drinking normally, it meant everything was okay with the water system. The donkey was like a living water quality test. His sense of smell and taste were so sharp that he'd refuse to drink if anything was wrong with the water. Over the years, Buster had helped Jake catch problems with the well pump, contaminated water lines, and even a dead mouse that had somehow gotten into the system. This particular Tuesday morning started like any other. Jake finished his coffee and headed over to check the water levels in all the troughs. The automatic system was working fine, keeping the big trough near the barn filled with fresh, cool water. He could see Buster in the distance, making his way over for his morning drink. But something was different this time. Buster walked up to the trough, just like always. But then he stopped. Not just slowed down, he actually stopped about 3 feet away from the water. Jake watched, curious, as the donkey stretched his neck forward and sniffed the air. Buster's ears were moving back and forth, the way they did when he was trying to figure something out. The donkey took one small step closer, then another. He lowered his head toward the water, but instead of drinking, he just stood there. His nostrils were flaring, and Jake could see that something was making him nervous. After about a minute, Buster lifted his head and backed away from the trough. Jake scratched his head, wondering what was going on. He walked over to the trough himself and looked down at the water. It looked perfectly clear and clean. He dipped his finger in and tasted it. Nothing unusual there either. The water was cool and fresh, just like it should be. "Come on, Buster," Jake called out. "What's wrong with you today?" The donkey looked at him but didn't move any closer to the water. Instead, Buster turned and walked away, heading toward the back pasture where there was a small creek. Jake had seen him drink from that creek before, but usually only when he was grazing far from the barn. Jake figured maybe Buster was just being picky today. Animals could be moody sometimes, just like people. Maybe the donkey had eaten something that left a funny taste in his mouth, or maybe he was coming down with a small bug. Jake had seen stranger things in his years of taking care of animals. The rest of the morning went normally. The horses came up to drink from the trough without any problems. The goats did the same. Even the chickens seemed happy with their water. It was only Buster who was acting strange. Around lunchtime, Jake decided to check on the donkey. He found Buster down by the creek, and sure enough, the animal was drinking plenty of water there. His head was down in the stream, taking long, satisfying drinks. Whatever was bothering him about the trough clearly didn't apply to the creek water. "You're a weird one, Buster," Jake said, giving the donkey a gentle pat on the neck. "But as long as you're drinking somewhere, I guess that's what matters." That evening, Jake filled up a bucket with water from the trough and carried it over to where Buster was grazing. He thought maybe the donkey would drink if the water was brought to him in a different container. But when he set the bucket down, Buster took one sniff and walked away. Now Jake was really puzzled. It wasn't the water itself that was the problem. The other animals were drinking it just fine. And it wasn't that Buster couldn't drink. He'd been drinking plenty from the creek all day. There was something specific about the trough area that was bothering the donkey. That night, Jake sat on his porch thinking about the situation. In all his years of keeping animals, he'd learned that when they acted strange, there was usually a good reason for it. Animals had senses that were much sharper than humans. They could smell things people couldn't smell, hear sounds that were too quiet for human ears, and sense danger long before people realized anything was wrong. But what kind of danger could there be around a water trough? Jake had built that trough himself, using good quality materials. It was solid wood, treated to be safe for animals. The water came from his well, which had been tested and was perfectly clean. The area around the trough was just packed dirt and some scattered hay. As he sat there in the gathering darkness, Jake made a decision. Tomorrow, he'd pay closer attention to Buster's behavior. If the donkey was trying to tell him something, he wanted to figure out what it was. Over the years, Buster had proven himself to be incredibly smart and reliable. If he was refusing to drink from the trough, there had to be a good reason. Jake had no idea that this simple decision would soon lead to a discovery that would make him grateful for the rest of his life that he'd listened to his donkey's warnings. Something was indeed wrong near that water trough, something far more dangerous than Jake could have imagined. And Buster, with his sharp senses and natural caution, was the only thing standing between Jake's peaceful ranch and a potentially deadly encounter. The next morning would bring more strange behavior from Buster, and Jake's concern would start to turn into real worry. Wednesday morning came with the same bright desert sunrise, but Jake found himself more worried than usual as he walked out to check on his animals. He'd spent most of the night thinking about Buster's strange behavior, and he was hoping that whatever had bothered the donkey yesterday was just a one-time thing. But as soon as he saw Buster approaching the water trough, Jake knew they still had a problem. The donkey walked up with the same cautious steps as the day before. He stopped at the same distance from the trough, stretched his neck forward to sniff, then backed away without taking a single drink. This time, Jake watched more carefully. He noticed that Buster's ears weren't just moving, they were actually laid back slightly, which was a sign that the donkey was genuinely upset or worried about something. His tail was swishing more than usual, too, another sign of nervousness. "Okay, buddy," Jake said softly, walking over to the donkey. "Let's figure this out together." Jake knelt down next to the trough and really examined it closely. He ran his hands along the wooden sides, checking for splinters or rough spots that might be bothering Buster. He smelled the water again, even cupping some in his hands to get a better sense of any odors he might have missed. Everything seemed perfectly normal. He stood up and looked around the area surrounding the trough. The ground was just packed dirt, same as it had been for years. There were some scattered pieces of hay and straw, but nothing unusual. A few small rocks here and there, but nothing that should frighten a donkey who'd been drinking from this same spot for over a decade. Still, Buster refused to come any closer. Instead, the donkey turned and headed off toward the creek again, just like he had the day before. Jake followed him and watched as Buster drank deeply from the running water. Whatever was wrong, it definitely had something to do with the trough area specifically, not with Buster's ability or desire to drink water. By Thursday morning, Jake's concern had turned into real worry. Not only was Buster still avoiding the trough, but the donkey was starting to show signs that all this extra walking to the creek was wearing him out. Buster was an older animal, probably around 15 years old, and making multiple trips to the back of the property just to get water was more exercise than he was used to. Jake could see that Buster's gums were starting to look a little pale, which was one of the first signs of dehydration in animals. The donkey's energy level seemed lower too. Normally, Buster would spend his mornings exploring different parts of the pasture, always curious about what might be growing in new spots. But today, he seemed content to just stay near the creek. Conserving his energy, that afternoon, Jake decided to try a different approach. He filled up several different containers with water from various sources around the property. He got water directly from the well, water from the creek, and even bought a jug of bottled water from town. Then he set up these different options. Near where Buster was resting, the results were very telling. Buster drank readily from the creek water and the bottled water. He even tried the water that came directly from the well. But when Jake offered him water that had been sitting in the trough, even though he'd put it in a completely different container, Buster sniffed it and turned away. This told Jake something important. It wasn't just the trough itself that was the problem. Somehow, even the water that had been in the trough was different from water that came from other sources. But Jake couldn't figure out how that was possible. The trough was fed by the same well that supplied water to his house and to the other watering systems around the property. Thursday night, Jake called his neighbor Bill, who'd been ranching in the area for even longer than Jake had. Bill listened to the whole story and suggested that maybe Buster had developed some kind of illness that was affecting his sense of taste or smell. Sometimes animals get sinus infections or other problems that mess with their ability to detect flavors, Bill explained. Maybe take him to see Doc Rodriguez in town. She's real good with large animals and she might be able to figure out what's going on. Jake thought that was good advice, so Friday morning he loaded Buster into his trailer and drove into town to see the veterinarian. Dr. Rodriguez was a woman in her 50s who'd been taking care of farm animals in the area for over 20 years. She had a reputation for being thorough and really understanding animal behavior. Dr. Rodriguez examined Buster carefully, checking his eyes, ears, nose, and mouth. She listened to his heart and lungs, felt around his neck and throat, and even took his temperature. Everything seemed normal. His physical condition is actually pretty good for a donkey his age, she told Jake. A little dehydrated, like you said, but not seriously. His senses all seem to be working fine, too. When I opened that bag of treats, his ears perked up right away, so his hearing is good. And he was very interested in the smell of the apple. His nose is working just fine. Dr. Rodriguez had Jake describe Buster's behavior in detail. She asked about when the behavior started, whether it was consistent, and what other symptoms Jake had noticed. When Jake mentioned that Buster would drink from other water sources but not from the trough, she looked thoughtful. Donkeys are incredibly smart animals, she said. They're actually much more cautious than horses, and they have excellent memories. If something scared him or made him sick near that trough, he might be avoiding it because he associates it with danger. But the fact that he won't even drink water that came from the trough, even when you put it in a different container, suggests that he's detecting something specific about that water. She suggested that Jake have the water tested, just to be sure there wasn't some kind of contamination that humans couldn't detect but that Buster's sharper senses could pick up. She also recommended setting up a temporary watering station closer to the creek, so Buster wouldn't have to work so hard to stay hydrated while they figured out the problem. In the meantime, Dr. Rodriguez said, trust your donkey's instincts. I've seen cases where animals detected problems long before their owners realized anything was wrong. Buster's trying to tell you something, and it's probably important. Jake drove home with more questions than answers, but he felt better knowing that Buster wasn't sick. That evening, he set up a temporary water tank near the creek, filling it with water from his garden hose. Buster drank from it immediately, which confirmed that the problem really was specific to the trough area. As Jake lay in bed that night, Dr. Rodriguez's words kept echoing in his mind. Buster's trying to tell you something, and it's probably important. But what could be so important about a water trough that a donkey would risk dehydration to avoid it? Tomorrow, Jake decided he was going to investigate that trough area more thoroughly than he ever had before. If Buster was trying to warn him about something, Jake was determined to figure out what it was. Saturday morning found Jake sitting on an old wooden crate about 20 feet away from the water trough, a notebook in his lap, and a thermos of coffee at his side. He'd decided that if he was going to figure out what was bothering Buster, he needed to watch everything more carefully than he'd ever watched anything before. The sun was just coming up, casting long shadows across the ranch yard. Jake had positioned himself where he could see the trough clearly, but where he wouldn't interfere with any of his animal's normal routines. He wanted to see exactly what Buster did, and when he did it at 6:15 a.m., Jake wrote in his notebook the horses came up to drink. Both of them, his Mara Daisy and the younger gelding Rex, approached the trough without any hesitation. They drank normally, taking their time, occasionally lifting their heads to look around before drinking some more. Nothing unusual there. At 6:32 a.m., the goats arrived. The three of them, 2 females and 1 male, also showed no signs of concern about the trough area. They drank, splashed a little water on themselves to cool off, and wandered away to start their morning grazing. At 6:48 a.m., Buster appeared. Jake watched intently as the donkey made his way across the yard. Buster's pace was normal until he got to about 10 feet from the trough. Then he slowed down noticeably. His ears, which had been relaxed, started moving forward and back, swiveling like little radar dishes trying to pick up sounds. When Buster got to about 6 feet from the trough, he stopped completely. Jake could see the donkey's nostrils flaring as he tested the air. Buster took one careful step forward, then another. At about 4 feet from the trough, he stretched his neck out as far as he could, trying to reach the water without getting his body any closer, but he couldn't quite make it. The trough was just a little too far away. Buster stood there for almost 3 full minutes, his neck stretched out, obviously wanting to drink, but unwilling to take those final steps that would bring him close enough to the water. Finally, Buster gave up. He backed away slowly, never taking his eyes off the trough area. Then he turned and walked toward the creek, where Jake knew he would drink plenty of water. Jake wrote down everything he'd observed, noting the times and describing Buster's behavior in detail, but he was still puzzled. What was it about that specific distance, about 4 feet from the trough, that seemed to be Buster's limit? What was the donkey sensing that Jake couldn't detect? For the next hour, Jake walked around the trough area, trying to see it from Buster's perspective. He got down on his hands and knees and crawled around, sniffing the ground and looking for anything unusual. He found nothing except dirt, a few pieces of old hay, and some scattered pebbles. He stood up and examined the trough itself again, running his hands over every inch of the wooden structure. It was solid and well built, just like it had been. For years, the water inside was clear and odorless. There were no cracks, no loose boards, no splinters that might be causing problems. Around 10 a.m., Jake decided to try an experiment. He moved his observation post closer to the trough, setting up his crate about 10 feet away. Maybe if he was closer, he'd be able to notice something he'd missed from farther away. But as soon as he settled into his new position, Jake started feeling uncomfortable. It wasn't anything specific, just a general sense of uneasiness. He found himself looking around more than usual, checking over his shoulders, feeling like something wasn't quite right. After about 20 minutes, he moved his crate back to its original position, and the uncomfortable feeling went away. That was interesting. Was it possible that there was something about that area that was affecting him too, but more subtly than it was affecting Buster? Animals were known to have much sharper senses than humans. Maybe whatever was bothering Buster was something that Jake could barely detect. If at all. In the early afternoon, Jake decided to test this theory. He asked his neighbor Bill to come over and help with an experiment. Without telling Bill what he was looking for, Jake asked him to walk around the trough area and tell him if he noticed anything unusual. Bill spent about 15 minutes walking around, looking at the trough from different angles, even kneeling down to examine the base and the ground around it. Finally, he stood up and shrugged. "Looks like a normal water trough to me," Bill said. "What exactly am I supposed to be looking for?" Jake explained about Buster's behavior and his own uncomfortable feeling when he'd sat too close to the trough. Bill listened with interest, then asked if he could try sitting in the same spot where Jake had felt uneasy. Bill settled onto the crate about 10 feet from the trough. At first he seemed fine. He chatted normally with Jake about ranch work and the weather. But after about 10 minutes, Jake noticed that Bill was fidgeting more than usual. He kept adjusting his position on the crate and looking around. You know, Bill said after about 15 minutes. I can't put my finger on it, but something does feel a little off over here. It's like when you're in the woods and you get that feeling that something's watching you, even though you can't see anything. This was very encouraging. If both Jake and Bill were picking up on something subtle, it made sense that Buster, with his much sharper senses, would detect it much more strongly. But what could it be? Jake spent the rest of Saturday afternoon researching possible causes. Online. He read about everything from underground gas leaks to electrical problems that might create electromagnetic fields. He learned about how animals could sometimes detect earthquakes or other geological activity long before humans noticed anything. He even read about how certain types of mold or bacteria could create odors that animals could smell but humans couldn't. None of these possibilities seemed to fit his situation exactly, but they all reinforced the same basic idea. Animals often knew about problems before people did. Sunday morning. Jake was back at his observation post before dawn. He wanted to watch Buster's behavior again, but this time he also planned to pay attention to any other animals that might come near the trough area. The horses and goats behaved normally, just like the day before. But Jake noticed something new. A couple of his chickens came wandering over toward the trough area, probably looking for bugs or scattered grain. But when they got to about the same distance where Buster always stopped, that 4-foot mark, the chickens started acting nervous. 2. They fluffed up their feathers and made soft, worried clucking sounds. Instead of scratching around in the dirt like they normally would, they hurried away. Now Jake was really onto something. It wasn't just Buster who was avoiding that area. Other animals were nervous about it too. But because they didn't need to drink from the trough, their avoidance wasn't as obvious. When Buster arrived for his attempted morning drink, Jake watched with new understanding. The donkey went through the same routine as before, but now Jake could see it as what it really was. Buster was trying to balance his need for water against his instinct to avoid danger. The donkey wanted to drink, but something was warning him. To stay away after Buster left for the creek, Jake made a decision. He was going to investigate that trough area more thoroughly than he'd ever investigated anything in his life. Tomorrow, he would start by moving everything away from the trough and examining every inch of the ground around it. If there was something there that was scaring his animals, he was going to find it. Little did Jake know that his decision to dig deeper would soon lead to a discovery that would make him understand just how much he owed to Buster's protective instincts. Monday morning arrived with a determination that Jake hadn't felt in years. He'd spent Sunday evening gathering tools and making a plan. Today, he was going to solve the mystery of Buster's behavior once and for all. He had a shovel, a rake, work gloves, and a flashlight, even though it was broad daylight. Something told him he might need to look into dark spaces. Jake started by carefully examining the area around the trough one more time. He walked in slowly expanding circles, looking for anything he might have missed during his previous investigations. The morning air was cool and still, perfect for concentrating on the task at hand. For the first hour, Jake found nothing unusual. Just the same packed dirt, scattered hay, and small rocks that had been there all along. But he was determined to be thorough. If Buster was detecting something that humans could barely sense, it might be something very subtle or well hidden. Around 9 a.m., Jake decided it was time to move the trough itself. It was a big, heavy wooden structure that he'd built to hold about 50 gallons of water. Normally, he never moved it because it was designed to stay in one permanent location. But if he was going to investigate properly, he needed to see what was underneath. First, Jake turned off the water supply and used a bucket to empty out most of the water from the trough. Even empty, the wooden structure was heavy, but Jake managed to tip it up on one side. As he lifted the corner, he immediately noticed that the ground underneath was much damper than the surrounding area. That made sense. After years of small spills and splashes, the soil would naturally retain more moisture. But as Jake lifted the trough higher to get a better look underneath, he saw something that made his blood run cold. There, coiled in the damp, cool space beneath the trough, was a snake. But this wasn't just any snake. It was a rattlesnake, and it was huge. Jake estimated it was at least 4 feet long and as thick around as his wrist. The snake's body was coiled into a tight spiral, its distinctive diamond-patterned skin clearly visible even in the shadowy space under the trough. Jake's first instinct was to drop the trough and jump backward, but somehow he managed to keep his grip and slowly, carefully lower the wooden structure back down. His heart was pounding so hard. He could hear it in his ears. His hands were shaking as he backed away from the trough, never taking his eyes off the spot where he'd seen the snake, once he was a safe distance away. Jake sat down heavily on his observation crate, trying to process what he'd just discovered. Everything suddenly made perfect sense. Buster hadn't been stubborn or sick or acting strangely for no reason. The donkey had been protecting himself, and possibly all the other animals on the ranch, from a deadly predator, rattlesnakes, was serious business in this part of Nevada. Their venom could kill a large animal like a horse or a donkey, especially if the bite was on the face or neck, exactly where an animal would be positioned while drinking from a low trough. Even for humans, a rattlesnake bite was a medical emergency that required immediate hospital treatment. Jake realized that for the past week, every time Buster had approached the trough, the donkey had been sensing the presence of this dangerous predator. Buster's keen nose had probably detected the snake's scent, even though the reptile was hidden underneath the trough. His sharp hearing might have picked up the sound of scales moving against wood or dirt. His natural caution had kept him from getting close enough to trigger a strike from the hidden snake, and it wasn't just Buster who'd been at risk. Jake himself had been walking around that area for days, kneeling down next to the trough, even crawling around on his hands and knees looking for clues. If he'd accidentally disturbed the snake, or if it had felt threatened enough to come out of its hiding place, Jake could have been bitten. The more Jake thought about it, the more grateful he became. Buster's refusal to drink from the trough hadn't just been animal behavior, it had been a warning that had potentially saved multiple lives. The horses, the goats, even Jake himself had all been drinking and working around that area, completely unaware of the danger lurking just inches beneath their feet. Jake also realized why he and Bill had felt uncomfortable when they'd sat close to the trough. Humans might not be able to consciously detect a snake's presence, but some part of their primitive survival instincts had probably picked up on subtle signs, maybe a faint scent, or tiny vibrations, or just that indefinable sense that predators give off when they're nearby. Now, Jake faced a new problem: what to do about the snake. He wasn't equipped to handle a rattlesnake himself, and he knew better than to try. These were dangerous animals that required special training and equipment to move safely. But he also couldn't just leave it there. Sooner or later, the snake would come out of its hiding place. And when it did, someone or some animal could get hurt. Jake carefully backed away from the trough area and went into his house to call for help. He looked up the number for the local wildlife control services, hoping they had someone who specialized in snake removal. While he waited for the phone to ring, Jake looked out his window toward the trough area. From this distance, everything looked perfectly normal and peaceful. But now he knew better. The Wildlife Control Office answered on the third ring. Jake explained the situation to the woman who answered the phone, describing the size and type of snake he'd found and exactly where it was located. She listened carefully and told him that they could have someone out within a couple of hours. "You did the right thing calling us," she said. "Rattlesnakes that size can be very dangerous, especially when they're in a confined space like you described. Don't try to move the trough again or disturb the area in any way. We'll bring the proper equipment to handle this safely." While Jake waited for the wildlife control team to arrive, he made sure all his animals were kept away from the trough area. He moved their temporary watering stations even farther away, just to be safe. As he worked, he kept thinking about how lucky they'd all been that Buster had been so insistent about avoiding the trough. Looking back over the past week, Jake could see all the signs he'd missed. Buster's nervousness, the way other animals had also seemed uncomfortable near the trough. Even his own uneasy feelings when he'd sat too close. The clues had all been there, but it had taken Buster's persistent refusal to drink to make Jake pay attention. As Jake sat waiting for help to arrive, He made a mental note to always trust his animal's instincts in the future. They had senses and survival skills that humans had mostly lost over thousands of years of civilization. When an animal as smart and reliable as Buster was trying to send a message, Jake would never ignore it again. The wildlife control team couldn't arrive soon. Enough. Every minute that Snake remained under the trough was another minute of danger for everyone on the ranch. The 2 hours Jake spent waiting for the wildlife control team felt like the longest 2 hours of his life. Every few minutes, he found himself looking toward the trough area, half expecting to see the rattlesnake slithering out from its hiding place. He tried to keep himself busy with other ranch chores, but his mind kept wandering back to that coiled, deadly shape he'd glimpsed beneath the wooden trough. During this waiting period, Jake's mind began racing through all the what-if scenarios. That could have happened over the past week. What if he'd ignored Buster's behavior and forced the donkey to drink from the trough? What if he'd decided to move the trough on one of the previous days when he was alone and hadn't been as careful? What if one of his horses, which were much less cautious than Buster, had somehow disturbed the snake while drinking? The more Jake thought about it, the more he realized how many close calls they'd probably had without knowing it. Rattlesnakes weren't usually aggressive unless they felt threatened or cornered, but they would definitely strike if something got too close to their hiding place. And animals drinking from a trough would be in exactly the right position, head down, neck extended to receive a potentially fatal bite. Jake also started thinking about the snake's perspective. The space under the trough would have been an ideal den site for a rattlesnake. It was cool, dark, and damp, perfect conditions for a desert reptile trying to escape the heat. The constant presence of water would also attract small animals like mice and rats, providing the snake with a reliable food source. From the snake's point of view, it had found the perfect place to live, but that didn't make it any less dangerous for Jake and his animals. Around 11 a.m., Jake heard the sound of a truck pulling into his driveway. He walked around to the front of his house and saw a white pickup truck with Desert Wildlife Control painted on the side. Two people got out, a woman who looked to be in her 40s and a younger man who was probably her assistant. The woman introduced herself as Lisa Chun, and she explained that she'd been handling snake removals in the area for over 15 years. Her assistant was Danny, who was learning the business and would be helping with the equipment. Both of them were wearing thick, protective clothing despite the warm morning air. "Before we start," Lisa said, "I want to hear exactly what happened and what you saw. Details are important when we're dealing with venomous snakes." Jake told them the whole story, from Buster's first refusal to drink all the way through his discovery of the snake that morning. Lisa listened carefully, asking questions about the size of the snake, how it was positioned, and whether Jake had seen any movement when he'd lifted the trough. "It sounds like you've got a mature rattlesnake that's been using that space as a den site," Lisa said when Jake finished his story. "The fact that your donkey detected it but wouldn't approach suggests that the snake has probably been there for a while, long enough to leave a strong scent trail." Lisa and Danny unloaded their equipment from the truck. Jake was impressed by how much specialized gear they brought. There were long-handled tools for moving snakes, thick protective gloves that went up to their elbows, and transparent tubes that could be used to safely contain captured reptiles. They also had a portable camera on a long pole, which Lisa explained would let them see under the trough without getting too close. "The first rule of snake removal," Lisa explained as they walked toward the trough area, "is never assume anything. Snakes can move faster than people expect, and they can strike much farther than most people realize. A 4-foot rattlesnake can easily strike 3 feet, and sometimes even farther if it's in the right position." As they approached the trough, Lisa had Jake point out exactly where he'd seen the snake and describe how he'd lifted the trough to discover it. She nodded thoughtfully and began setting up her camera equipment. "We're going to take a look before we do anything else," she said. "I want to see exactly what we're dealing with and make sure there's only one snake under there. Sometimes they den together, especially during cooler weather." Danny helped Lisa position the camera pole so they could slide it under the edge of the trough. Jake watched from a safe distance as they maneuvered the camera into position. Lisa was looking at a small screen that showed the camera's view, and Jake could see her expression become more serious as she studied what she was seeing. "Okay," Lisa said quietly. "I can confirm there's definitely a large rattlesnake under there. Looks like it might be even bigger than you thought, probably close to 5 feet long. And it's positioned right in the center of the space, coiled up in a classic defensive posture." She showed Jake the screen and he could see the snake clearly. It looked even more intimidating on camera than it had during his brief glimpse that morning. The snake's triangular head was clearly visible, and Jake could see the distinctive pattern of diamonds along its back. "The good news," Lisa continued, "is that it appears to be alone. I don't see any signs of other snakes in the area. The bad news is that it's positioned in a way that's going to make removal tricky. We can't just lift the trough and grab it, because that would put us in striking range." Lisa explained their plan. First, they would use long-handled tools to encourage the snake to move toward one side of the space under the trough. Then they would partially lift the trough to give the snake an escape route while simultaneously using their capture equipment to control where it went. "The key," Lisa said, "is to make the snake think it's escaping on its own terms while we guide it into our containment system. If we try to force it or make it feel more threatened than it already does, it's going to become much more dangerous." To handle, Jake watched from about 30 feet away as Lisa and Danny began their careful work. They moved slowly and deliberately, using their long-handled tools to gently encourage the snake to shift its position. Jake could hear a soft rattling sound as the snake became aware of the disturbance and began warning them to stay away. The process took almost an hour. Every movement had to be calculated and careful. Several times, Lisa and Danny had to stop and reassess their approach when the snake moved in an unexpected direction. Jake found himself holding his breath during the most tense moments, especially when they began lifting the trough and the snake became more agitated. Finally, Lisa was able to guide the snake into a clear containment tube. Once the snake was safely secured, Jake felt like he could breathe normally again. The immediate danger was over. "That's a beautiful specimen," Lisa said as she sealed the containment tube. "Probably about 15 years old, based on its size. It's been living, well, probably feeding on the rodents that come to drink from your water sources." Jake was amazed at how professional and calm Lisa and Danny had remained throughout the entire process. What had seemed like a terrifying situation to him was clearly just another day at work for them. With the rattlesnake safely contained in the clear tube, Jake finally felt like he could relax for the first time in over a week. But Lisa wasn't quite finished yet. She wanted to make sure there weren't any other snakes in the area, and she also wanted to give Jake some important information about why this had happened and how to prevent it in the future. "This is actually more common than most people realize," Lisa explained as she and Danny began checking the area around the trough for signs of other snakes. "We get calls like this several times a month, especially during the warmer parts of the year. Artificial water sources like troughs create what we call micro-ecosystems that are very attractive to desert wildlife." Lisa used her camera equipment to check under and around other structures near the barn. She looked under Jake's tool shed, around the foundation of the barn itself, and in several other spots where snakes might be likely to hide. Jake was grateful for her thoroughness. The last thing he wanted was to discover there were more snakes hiding around his property. "The drought conditions we've been having lately make situations like this even more likely," Lisa continued as she worked. "When natural water sources dry up, animals are forced to look for alternatives. Your trough provides not just water, but also the kind of environment that attracts small mammals, which are exactly what rattlesnakes like to eat." Danny was taking detailed notes about the location where they'd found the snake, and the conditions that had made it an attractive den site. Lisa explained that this information helped them understand patterns of snake movement in the area and could be useful for preventing future problems. "The space under your trough was basically perfect from a rattlesnake's perspective," Lisa said. "Cool, dark, damp, with easy access to food and water. Plus, it was protected from larger predators and from extreme weather." If I were a snake looking for a place to live, I'd probably choose the same spot. As they worked, Lisa also explained more about rattlesnake behavior that Jake found fascinating and useful. She told him that snakes don't actually want to encounter humans or large animals. Their venom is primarily for hunting small prey, and using it for defense means they have to use up valuable energy to produce more. That's why your donkey's behavior was so smart, Lisa said. Rattlesnakes usually give plenty of warning before they strike. They'd much rather have potential threats just go away than have to fight. Your donkey was picking up on those warning signals, probably scent marks and maybe even very low-frequency sounds that the snake was making. Jake asked about the timing of when the snake had probably taken up residence under his trough. Lisa estimated that, based on the snake's apparent comfort level in that location, it had probably been there for at least several weeks, possibly even longer. Snakes are creatures of habit, she explained. Once they find a good spot, they tend to stay there as long as the conditions remain favorable. This snake probably established a regular routine, hunting at night, returning to the den site during the day, coming out to warm up in the sun when the temperature was right. This information made Jake realize that Buster might have been detecting the snake's presence for longer than the week when he'd started refusing to drink. The donkey might have been aware of the snake but not felt threatened by it initially, especially if the snake was spending most of its time hidden and inactive. What probably changed, Lisa said, was the snake's behavior as the weather got warmer. Snakes are more active in warm weather, and this one might have started moving around more or positioned itself closer to the surface under the trough. That would have made its scent stronger and more detectable to your donkey. After about 45 minutes of checking the area, Lisa declared that she was confident there were no other snakes in the immediate vicinity. She and Danny began packing up their equipment while she gave Jake detailed advice about preventing future snake problems. The most important thing is to eliminate the conditions that make your property attractive to snakes, Lisa said. That means controlling rodent populations, removing hiding places like brush piles or unused equipment, and being careful about water sources. She suggested that Jake elevate his water trough slightly off the ground, maybe by putting it on a concrete pad or a wooden platform. This would eliminate the dark, cool space underneath that had been so attractive to the snake. She also recommended regular inspections of areas around his buildings and equipment. You might also want to consider installing some motion-activated lights around your water sources, Lisa added. Snakes don't like sudden bright lights, and the lights will also help you see any wildlife activity around those areas. Lisa also praised Jake for paying attention to Buster's behavior and not trying to force the donkey to drink from the trough. We see too many cases where people ignore their animals' warning signals and end up with serious problems. Your donkey probably saved lives by being so persistent about avoiding that area. Before loading the snake into their truck for relocation, Lisa let Jake get a closer look at the captured rattlesnake. In the clear containment tube, Jake could see just how large and impressive the snake really was. Its diamond patterns were clearly defined, and its rattle was well developed, indicating a mature animal. "Where will you take it?" Jake asked. "We have several designated release sites in remote desert areas about 30 miles from here," Lisa explained. "These are areas with good habitat for rattlesnakes, but far enough from human activity that there's little chance of conflict. This snake will be relocated to an environment where it can live normally without posing a threat to people or domestic animals." Lisa also explained that relocated snakes usually adapt well to new environments, especially when they're moved to habitat that's similar to where they were found. This snake has proven it's good at finding food and shelter, so it should do fine in its new location. As Lisa and Danny prepared to leave, Jake realized he wanted to do something to show his appreciation for their professional and thorough work. He offered to pay extra for the service, but Lisa told him that the standard fee covered everything they'd done. "Just spread the word about what happened here," she said. "The more people understand about living safely with desert wildlife, the fewer problems we all have. And give that donkey of yours some extra treats. He's a hero in my book." Jake watched the wildlife control truck drive away, carrying the snake that had been living just a few feet from where he walked every day. He felt an overwhelming sense of relief, but also a new appreciation for the complex relationships between humans, domestic animals, and wild creatures in the desert environment where he'd chosen to make his home. Now it was time to restore the trough area and see if Buster would return to his normal drinking routine. After the wildlife control team left, Jake stood alone in his ranch yard, looking at the water trough that had been the center of so much worry and mystery over the past week. The immediate danger was gone, but Jake knew he had work to do before he could consider the situation truly resolved. Following Lisa's advice, he needed to modify the trough setup to prevent future snake problems, and more importantly, he needed to see if Buster would trust the area again. Jake started by thoroughly cleaning and disinfecting the entire trough area. Even though the snake was gone, he wanted to eliminate any scent traces that might still be making his animals nervous. He used a garden hose to wash down the wooden trough itself, scrubbing every surface with a mild bleach solution that would be safe for animals, but strong enough to remove any lingering odors. Next, Jake tackled the ground around the trough. He raked up all the old hay and scattered debris, then used his shovel to level and pack down the dirt where the trough had been sitting. Following Lisa's suggestion about eliminating hiding places, Jake was much more thorough than he'd ever been before, making sure there weren't any small depressions or gaps where creatures could hide. The biggest change Jake made was elevating the trough off the ground. He drove into town and bought concrete blocks to create a solid foundation that would raise the trough about 6 inches above ground level. This would eliminate the dark, enclosed space underneath that had been so attractive to the snake. Building the new foundation took most of the afternoon. Jake had to make sure the blocks were perfectly level so the trough wouldn't wobble or tip when animals drank from it. He also had to adjust the water supply line to accommodate the new height. It was hot, sweaty work, but Jake felt good about making these improvements. While he worked, Jake noticed that his animals were giving the trough area a wide berth. Word had apparently spread through the ranch's animal population that this was a place to avoid. Even his normally curious chickens, who usually investigated any changes to their environment, stayed well away from where Jake was working. This made Jake realize that restoring his animals' confidence in the area might take time, even with the snake gone and the improvements made. Animals had long memories when it came to danger, and they wouldn't quickly forget the fear they'd associated with this location. As the sun began to set, Jake finished installing the trough on its new elevated foundation. He reconnected the water supply and filled the trough with fresh, clean water. Everything looked good, but the real test would come the next morning when his animals needed to drink. That evening, Jake made a special trip to check on Buster. He found the donkey grazing peacefully near the creek, apparently content with his alternative water source. Jake spent some time just sitting with Buster, patting his neck and talking to him about what had happened. "You were right all along, buddy," Jake said softly. "I should have trusted you from the very first day. You probably saved my life and maybe the lives of all the other animals too." Buster seemed to sense Jake's gratitude. The donkey nuzzled against him in his gentle way, accepting the attention and the apology. But Jake could tell that Buster was still alert and watchful. The donkey's ears continued to move and swivel, monitoring sounds and potential threats even while he was being petted. Tuesday morning arrived with Jake feeling nervous about what would happen when his animals discovered the changes to the trough area. He positioned himself at his old observation post, notebook ready to document their reactions. The horses were the first to investigate. Daisy and Rex approached the modified trough setup cautiously, clearly noticing that something was different. They sniffed around the new concrete foundation and examined the elevated position of the trough. After a few minutes of careful inspection, both horses seemed to decide that the changes were acceptable. They drank normally, though perhaps a bit more alertly than usual. The goats were next, and they were even more cautious than the horses. Goats were naturally curious animals, but they were also very aware of potential dangers. They spent a long time investigating the new setup, even climbing up on the concrete blocks to examine them from different angles. Eventually, they too decided the water was safe to drink, but the real test was still to come. At 7:15 a.m., Jake saw Buster making his way across the yard toward the trough area. Jake held his breath as he watched the donkeys approach. Buster's behavior was completely different from what it had been over the past week. Instead of slowing down and becoming nervous as he got closer to the trough, the donkey maintained his normal, confident pace. His ears were still alert, but they weren't showing the anxious, swiveling behavior that had characterized his previous attempts to drink. When Buster reached the trough area, he paused briefly to examine the new concrete foundation and the elevated position of the water. He walked around the entire setup once, sniffing carefully at the blocks and the ground around them. Jake could see the donkey's nostrils flaring as he tested the air for any traces of the scent that had warned him away before. After completing his inspection, Buster stepped up to the trough and lowered his head to the water. For the first time in over a week, Jake watched his donkey drink deeply and contentedly from the main water source. Buster took his time, drinking long and thoroughly, making up for all the extra effort he'd had to expend walking to the creek. Jake felt tears of relief welling up in his eyes as he watched Buster drink. The crisis was truly over. His faithful donkey had not only protected himself and the other animals from danger, but he had also quickly recognized when that danger was gone. Buster's ability to detect both threat and safety was remarkable. After finishing his drink, Buster lifted his head and looked directly toward where Jake was sitting. For a moment, the man and the donkey just looked at each other across the ranch yard. Jake felt like there was a communication passing between them, an acknowledgement of what they'd been through together and a mutual understanding that had deepened their bond over the next few days. All of Jake's animals gradually returned to their normal routines around the trough area. The chickens resumed their bug hunting activities nearby. The horses and goats showed no signs of nervousness. Most importantly, Buster went back to his predictable morning routine of being the first to drink, taking his time at the trough before wandering off to graze, but Jake noticed that Buster remained more alert than he'd been before. The donkey's head came up more frequently while drinking, and his ears continued to monitor the environment more actively. It was as if the experience had heightened Buster's natural caution without making him fearful. Jake was grateful for this increased vigilance. If there were ever another threat around the ranch, he was confident that Buster would detect it early and warn him through his behavior. The partnership between man and animal had been strengthened by their shared experience with danger and successful resolution. The elevated trough worked perfectly, eliminating the hiding spaces that had attracted the snake while providing easy access for all of Jake's animals. The modifications had been worth every bit of effort and expense. 3 months had passed since the snake incident, and life on Jake's ranch had settled into a new normal. But the experience had changed both Jake and Buster in ways that continued to reveal themselves in their daily interactions. What had started as a simple mystery about why a donkey wouldn't drink had become a profound lesson about trust, communication, and the wisdom that animals possess. Jake found himself paying attention to his animals' behavior in ways he never had before. Every morning, as he made his rounds checking on water, feed, and the general condition of his livestock, he watched for subtle signs that might indicate problems he couldn't see or sense himself. He'd learned that his animals were like an early warning system, capable of detecting dangers long before they became obvious to human senses. This new awareness had already paid off in several small ways. When his chickens started avoiding a particular corner of their co-op, Jake investigated and found a small gas leak from a propane line that needed repair. When his horses seemed reluctant to graze in a certain section of pasture, Jake discovered a broken fence post that could have caused injury if an animal had rubbed against it the wrong way, but it was with Buster that Jake's relationship had changed the most dramatically. The donkey had always been Jake's favorite animal, but now there was a deeper level of mutual respect and communication between them. Jake had learned to read Buster's body language more carefully, and Buster seemed to understand that Jake was now paying attention to his warnings. Jake started what he called his Buster checks, times when he would specifically observe the donkey's behavior around different areas of the ranch. If Buster seemed comfortable and relaxed in an area, Jake felt confident that it was safe. If the donkey showed any signs of nervousness or avoidance, Jake investigated thoroughly before dismissing the behavior as unimportant. The system had become particularly valuable during the summer months, when rattlesnake activity was at its highest. Jake had learned from Lisa that snakes were most active during warm weather, and he'd developed a routine of checking for signs of snake presence around all the water sources and sheltered areas on his property. The elevated trough had worked perfectly. Jake had installed motion sensor lights around it, as Lisa had suggested, and the combination of eliminating hiding spaces and providing better visibility had kept the area snake-free. But more importantly, it had restored Buster's confidence in using the main water source. Jake had also made improvements to other areas of his ranch based on what he'd learned during the snake incident. He'd cleared away brush piles and unused equipment that could provide hiding places for unwanted wildlife. He'd installed better lighting around his barn and outbuildings, and he'd created a regular inspection schedule for checking under and around structures where snakes might be tempted to den. Word of Jake's experience had spread among the ranching community in his area. Other ranchers started asking him about animal behavior and how to recognize when livestock might be trying to warn about hidden dangers. Jake found himself becoming something of an informal expert on reading animal warning signs. Bill, his neighbor who had helped with the investigation, had implemented similar changes on his own property after hearing the full story of what had happened. "If it hadn't been for your donkey," Bill told Jake, "we might never have known how common this problem is around here. Now I watch my animals completely differently." Dr. Rodriguez, the veterinarian who had examined Buster, was also interested in Jake's story. She asked him to speak to a group of local ranchers about the importance of paying attention to unusual animal behavior. Jake was nervous about public speaking, but he felt that sharing his experience might help other people avoid dangerous situations. During his talk to the ranchers group, Jake emphasized several key points that he'd learned from his experience. First, when animals change their normal behavior patterns, there's usually a good reason that humans should investigate. Second, animals have senses that are much sharper than human senses, and they can detect dangers that people might miss completely. Third, it's important to trust animal instincts even when the reason for their behavior isn't immediately obvious. "The biggest mistake I almost made," Jake told the group, "was thinking that I knew better than my donkey. Buster was trying to save our lives, but I was so focused on solving what I thought was a problem with the donkey that I almost missed the real problem entirely." Jake also shared the practical lessons he'd learned about ranch safety and wildlife management. He talked about the importance of eliminating hiding places for snakes, maintaining good lighting around work areas, and having the contact information for wildlife control services readily available. But perhaps the most important change for Jake was philosophical. He developed a much deeper appreciation for the intelligence and protective instincts of his animals. He'd always known that animals were smart, but the snake incident had shown him that they possessed kinds of intelligence that humans often overlooked or undervalued. Buster, in particular, had revealed himself to be not just a smart animal, but a guardian who was actively looking out for the safety of his human and the other animals on the ranch. The donkey's persistent refusal to drink from the trough hadn't been stubbornness or illness. It had been a calculated decision to avoid danger and a determined effort to communicate that danger to Jake. As Jake reflected on the experience months later, he realized that it had made him a better rancher and a better observer of the natural world around him. He'd learned to see his property through the eyes of the animals who lived there, understanding that they experienced their environment in ways that provided information he couldn't access through his own senses. The relationship between Jake and Buster had evolved into something approaching a partnership. Jake provided food, water, shelter, and medical care. In return, Buster served as an alert and intelligent sentinel, using his keen senses to monitor for threats and his expressive behavior to communicate important information on quiet evenings. Jake would often sit with Buster in the pasture, just enjoying the donkey's calm presence and reflecting on how much he'd learned from this remarkable animal. The snake incident had been frightening while it was happening, but it had ultimately strengthened the bond between them and taught Jake lessons that would make him a better caretaker of all his animals for years to come. Jake had always heard people say that animals were good judges of character, but now he understood that they were also excellent judges of danger. Buster had proven himself to be not just a beloved pet, but a true protector whose instincts and intelligence had literally saved lives. For that, Jake would be grateful for the rest of his days.